Picture this. It's a bitter February morning in 1869, and the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey echo with the scrape of pickaxes and the heavy breathing of workmen. Flickering torchlight throws dancing shadows across Gothic arches as Dean Arthur Stanley peers down into a freshly opened void beneath the marble floor. The air is thick with centuries of dust and something else, the unmistakable cloying scent of decay that has been trapped in darkness for over 200 years. In his hands, Stanley clutches detailed architectural drawings and burial records that contradict each other. Somewhere in this labyrinth of vaults lies the lost tomb of King James I. But what he's about to discover will reveal far more sinister secrets about the treatment of royal remains. Secrets that will make your skin crawl and forever change how you think about the glorious history of England's monarchs. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Let's go back to where this dark tale truly begins. Not in 1869, but on a cold March morning in 1603 at Richmond Palace. Queen Elizabeth I lay speechless on the floor for 4 days before her servants finally managed to settle her into bed. The woman who had defied the Spanish Armada, who had danced until dawn and dazzled foreign ambassadors with her wit, was now a pathetic figure clinging to life with the desperate grip of someone who knows that to lie down is to never rise again. Elizabeth's emotional and physical ailments escalated to the point that she took to standing in her bedchamber, up for 15 hours without assistance before collapsing onto the floor, which her ladies-in-waiting had covered with cushions. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful woman in Europe, reduced to standing motionless for hours, too terrified to rest because some primal instinct told her that horizontal meant death. Her ladies-in-waiting had covered the floor with cushions. They knew what was coming. They were waiting for their queen to fall. The courtiers whispered about strange omens. Elizabeth Southwell, a lady-in-waiting, reported that the queen was haunted by visions of her frail body, and that a playing card with a nail through its head was found on the queen's chair toward the end of her life. A playing card with a nail through its head. Imagine the psychological torture this represented to a woman who had spent her entire life believing she was chosen by God to rule. By this point in her life, the Virgin Queen was anything but the glittering icon of royal propaganda. She had lost most of her teeth, suffered hair loss, refused to be attended to and bathed. The courtiers who had once competed for her attention now recoiled from the stench of an unwashed body and the sight of blackened gums where once had been the pearly smile that had captivated Europe. When Elizabeth finally died on March 24th, 1603, something disturbing happened that would fuel centuries of speculation. The Queen's Lady of the Bedchamber refused to allow Elizabeth's body to be subject to a post-mortem. Some argue that this was a way to safeguard the Queen's reputation as a virgin. But why would they refuse? What were they hiding? Was it simply to preserve the myth of the Virgin Queen, or was there something more sinister? Something about Elizabeth's body that they couldn't allow the world to see. The funeral procession that wound its way through London on April 28, 1603, was a spectacle that brought grown men to tears. Elizabeth's coffin was carried from Whitehall to Westminster Abbey on a hearse drawn by horses hung with black velvet. The coffin was covered in a rich purple cloth, topped with the effigy of Elizabeth with a sceptre in her hands and a crown on her head. That effigy, that painted wooden figure dressed in royal robes, was so lifelike that mourners gasped when they saw it. At the funeral, an effigy of Elizabeth I was placed on top of her lead coffin. Dressed in royal robes, the effigy was so lifelike that it made mourners gasp. It was as if Elizabeth herself was lying there, still wearing her crown, still clutching her sceptre, refusing to let go of power even in death. Westminster was surcharged with multitudes of all sorts of people in their streets, houses, windows, leads and gutters that came out to see the obsequy, and when they beheld her statue lying upon the coffin, there was such a general sighing, groaning and weeping, as the like hath not been seen or known in the memory of man. Her body was encased in lead within the wooden coffin, and first buried in the vault of her grandfather, King Henry VII, underneath his monument in the abbey. Lead coffins were the royal standard. They were supposed to preserve the body and contain any unpleasant odours. But as we'll discover, lead coffins had their own sinister secrets. 3 years after Elizabeth's death, in 1606, something happened that reveals the cold political calculations that governed even royal burials. Elizabeth's successor, King James I, had Elizabeth's remains moved to join those of her half-sister Mary in the north aisle of Henry VII's chapel in Westminster Abbey. Think about the symbolism here. Elizabeth and Mary, two sisters who had lived in bitter opposition, one Catholic, one Protestant, one who had burned hundreds of heretics, one who had executed a rival queen. In life they had been enemies. In death, James I literally stacked one on top of the other. Elizabeth's coffin was placed above that of Mary, in a vault below a new white marble monument ordered by James and made by sculptor Maximilian Colt and painted by Jan de Kritz. The tomb bore only Elizabeth's effigy and inscriptions about Elizabeth's reign. Mary, who had ruled for 5 bloody years, was reduced to a footnote, literally buried beneath her sister's glory. The inscription tried to put a diplomatic spin on this uncomfortable arrangement. Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in the hope of the resurrection. But the reality was far less peaceful. Elizabeth's massive lead coffin, weighing hundreds of pounds, was simply placed on top of Mary's coffin, creating a grotesque double-decker tomb that would remain undisturbed for more than 2 centuries. By the 1860s, Westminster Abbey faced a problem that would lead to one of the most extraordinary archaeological adventures in British history. The exact location of King James I's tomb had been lost for over 2 centuries. Burial records contradicted each other, and the Abbey's archives were a mess of conflicting information. Dean Arthur Stanley, a man with the soul of an explorer and the methodical mind of a scholar, received permission from Queen Victoria herself to conduct a comprehensive survey of the Abbey's burial vaults. What he was about to discover would read like something from an Indiana Jones adventure, if Indiana Jones had dealt with rotting royalty instead of ancient treasures. The search began with careful excavation in Henry VII's chapel. At its base, a tablet was inscribed. This vault was opened by the Dean February 11th, 1869. That date, February 11, was exactly 366 years to the day since Elizabeth of York had died in childbirth. Was this a coincidence, or did Stanley deliberately choose this date for some symbolic reason? When Stanley's workmen finally broke through the stone ceiling Elizabeth and Mary's vault, the scene that greeted them was like something from a Gothic horror novel. The vault was small, cramped, and filled with the stale air of centuries. In the flickering torchlight, 2 lead coffins lay stacked like some macabre bunk bed. Elizabeth's coffin, on top, was larger and more elaborate, larger and more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. The lead had tarnished over the centuries, taking on a greenish patina that made the coffins look ancient and alien. In the 19th century, researchers looking for the tomb of James I partially opened the underground vault containing the remains of Elizabeth I and Mary Aberneilond. The lead coffins were stacked, with Elizabeth's resting on top of her half-sisters. But it was what Stanley found inscribed on Elizabeth's coffin that sent chills down his spine. Drawing of the Tudor rose, initials and date marked upon the coffin lid of Elizabeth I documented these markings carefully. The Tudor rose, initials and dates that told the story of Elizabeth's journey from life to death to this final resting place. But there were other markings that were more disturbing. Graffiti etched into the lead revealed that a certain John Ware and E.C. had been there in 1645, the year James was interred in the vault. Someone named John Ware had carved his name into the lead of a royal coffin in 1645. Who was John Ware? A workman? A grave robber? A curious official? We'll never know, but his graffiti tells us that royal vaults weren't as secure as the authorities claimed. What else might they have done while they were down there? The possibilities are disturbing. In an age when royal relics were valuable commodities, an unguarded vault full of royal corpses would have been an irresistible target. Now we need to talk about something that the Victorian accounts delicately avoided. The smell when you break the seal on a vault that has been closed for centuries. You're not just opening a tomb, you're releasing an atmosphere of concentrated decay that has been trapped like a malevolent genie in a bottle. Elizabeth Southwell also reported that the Queen's corpse was so full of noxious vapours that it exploded in her lead coffin. While Southwell was later deemed an unreliable source, the claim about bodily gases and lead coffins wasn't entirely far-fetched. Lead coffins, for all their supposed advantages, could become pressure cookers of putrefaction. When organic matter decomposes in a sealed environment, it produces gases, methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and dozens of other compounds. In a wooden coffin, these gases can escape through the wood. In a lead coffin, they build up pressure until something gives way. The accounts from other royal vault openings support this disturbing picture. When Edward I's vault was opened at Windsor, the lower part of the leg bones and feet were submerged in 3 inches of a black liquid, later identified, or at least deduced to be, the result of putrefaction of the body combined with the remains of the wooden coffin. The weight of Elizabeth's lead coffin would have been immense. A modern royal lead-lined coffin can weigh over 500 pounds, requiring 8 pallbearers instead of the usual 6. Elizabeth I's coffin, with its thick lead walls and royal proportions, would have been similarly massive. Now imagine that weight pressing down on Mary's coffin below. For over 260 years, Elizabeth's remains literally crushed down on her sisters, creating a grotesque sandwich of royal decay that no amount of ceremony or dignity could make less disturbing. Elizabeth and Mary's story fits into a broader, deeply disturbing pattern of how royal remains were treated in Britain. The dead, no matter how powerful they had been in life, became pawns in political games that continued long after their hearts had stopped beating. Also in Westminster Abbey, King Edward the Confessor's coffin was moved to a new shrine and opened by a curious Henry II in 1163. Edward was discovered with his long white beard intact and still dressed in cloth of gold with an embroidered mitre on his head and purple shoes on his feet. The pilgrim's ring Edward wore was taken by Henry II as a relic, and the cloth of gold turned into 3 splendid copes, long cloaks. This casual desecration of royal remains wasn't unusual. It was standard practice. Medieval and Renaissance monarchs routinely moved, examined, and even plundered the tombs of their predecessors. During research, I discovered the disturbing tale of what happened to the body of Duke Humphrey of Gloucester. His tomb at the Abbey Church of St Alban was regularly visited by women who believed the embalming fluid used had magical properties to cure wrinkles. The sexton made a small fortune selling thimbles of the potions, and physicians even took away samples for experimentation. Eventually the liquid ran out and visitors took Humphrey's nails and hair until only a few small bones remained. The traffic in royal body parts was a thriving business. Hair, teeth, bones, even embalming fluid. Anything that had once been part of a king or queen could be sold to collectors, physicians, or people who believed in the magical properties of royal remains. In 1784, the churchwardens of St Mary's in Bury St Edmunds removed the altar monument of King Henry VII's daughter Mary Tudor, the French queen. Quite unnecessarily, they opened her coffin and found her hair was perfectly sound and of considerable length, some 2 feet long, and of a beauteous golden colour. The tomb of King Richard II was opened in 1871 during restoration work, and the skeleton was found to be nearly perfect. Several relics were taken from the tomb and were later found in a cigarette box in the basement of London's National Portrait Gallery. The contents of the box, dated the 31st of August 1871, included fragments of wood from the coffin, as well as some fabric and leather from one of the royal gloves. A cigarette box full of royal body parts sitting in a basement for decades. This is what happened to kings and queens once they were safely dead and unable to defend themselves. Perhaps one of the best-known stories is of poor Queen Catherine of Valois, whose corpse was shown to visitors on payment to the staff at Westminster Abbey staff. For centuries, her remains were displayed in a wooden coffin that was opened for tourists who paid Abbey staff for the privilege of viewing a royal corpse. Above the vault where Elizabeth and Mary lay stacked like cordwood, James I had erected a monument that was as much propaganda as memorial. The monument showed Elizabeth in all her glory, crown, sceptre, royal robes. But an image, discovered circa 1618 to 20, shows the Queen wearing an ermine-lined crimson robe with a blue orb in her hand, a coloured dress and flesh colouring on her face. The 4 lions at each corner of the effigy were gilded. No trace of this colour now remains. This painted effigy was a lie, made of marble and pigment. It showed Elizabeth as she wanted to be remembered, powerful, beautiful, eternal. Below, in the darkness of the vault, the reality was far different. The woman who had once commanded fleets and terrorized kings was reduced to whatever remained inside a lead box, stacked on top of her sister like luggage in a storage room. Stanley's published account was written for Victorian sensibilities, which meant he had to be discreet about certain details. But reading between the lines of his careful prose, we can infer what he really encountered in that vault. The upper one, larger and more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. That phrase, distinctly shaped in the form of the body, is telling. It suggests that Elizabeth's lead coffin had maintained its human outline, that the lead had been moulded around her corpse and had preserved that shape even after 2.5 centuries. The Victorian obsession with propriety meant that certain observations would never have made it into the official record. If there had been any evidence of unpleasant odours, visible damage to the coffins, or signs that decomposition had not proceeded as expected, Stanley would have noted it privately but never published such details. Elizabeth's story doesn't end with Stanley's examination. Even after death, she continued to be a political symbol manipulated by those in power. In 1975, nearly 4 centuries after her death, the gilded collar, with a representation of the Burgundy or Three Brothers pendant, was added in 1975 and made by Mrs. H. Hughes. Someone decided Elizabeth's effigy needed updating, needed more jewellery to maintain her royal image. If you could somehow descend into Elizabeth's vault today, what would you find? The lead coffins would still be there, still stacked in their original configuration, but lead is soft and time is relentless. After more than 4 centuries, those coffins would show signs of their age, corrosion, compression, possibly even structural failure. The inscriptions Stanley documented, the Tudor rose, the initials, the dates would still be visible on the lead, like signatures in a guest book from the land of the dead. The graffiti left by John Ware in 1645 would still be there too, a reminder that even royal tombs aren't truly secure. Perhaps the most profound truth revealed by Elizabeth's story is that death is the great equalizer. No amount of lead, no thickness of stone, no beauty of monuments can ultimately protect anyone from the simple biological reality of decay. Elizabeth, who had commanded the seas and defied the Pope, was reduced to whatever remained in a lead box, subject to the same forces of decomposition as the humblest peasant. The Virgin Queen, who had never submitted to any man in life, was ultimately conquered by time, gravity, and the basic chemistry of organic decay. The woman who had been too proud to marry became intimately connected to her despised sister, their remains literally intertwined in a grotesque parody of sisterly affection. The real stinking coffin in this story isn't just Elizabeth's lead casket, it's the entire system that treated royal remains as political props rather than human dignity. The stench isn't just the smell of decomposition, it's the moral odour of a society that couldn't let even the dead rest in peace. Every time Elizabeth's remains were moved, examined or disturbed, it revealed something ugly about the living. James I stacking the sisters showed his casual disregard for their humanity. The graffiti carvers of 1645 showed the vulnerability of even royal dignity. Stanley's Victorian examination showed the era's obsession with scientific curiosity over human respect. And today we tell this story as entertainment, reducing real human remains to historical curiosities. We're still not letting Elizabeth rest in peace. We're still treating her death as a commodity, still consuming the details of her decay for our own amusement. In the end, Elizabeth I, who had fought so hard for freedom, who had defied every attempt to control her, ended up in the most confining prison of all. Not marriage to Philip of Spain, not execution like her mother, but a lead box in a stone vault stacked on top of her sister, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to escape. The woman who had said, "I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king," discovered that even the heart and stomach of a king are no match for time, chemistry, and the cold political calculations of those who outlive you. As you walk through Westminster Abbey today, remember that beneath your feet lie not just the glorious monuments to England's greatest queen, but the disturbing reality of what happens when power dies. The beautiful marble effigy above ground tells one story, the story of eternal glory and royal dignity. The lead coffin below tells another, the story of decay, disturbance, and the ultimate helplessness of even the mighty. The stench of Elizabeth's coffin has long since faded, but the stench of what we do to each other in life and in death lingers on. Perhaps that's the real horror story here. Not what happened to Elizabeth's body, but what it reveals about the living who couldn't leave her alone. In the darkness below Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth I waits still, her lead coffin slowly corroding, her remains slowly settling, her sister's bones still bearing her weight after more than 4 centuries. The Virgin Queen, who never bowed to any man in life, lies forever horizontal in death, finally conquered by the one force that no amount of royal power could defeat, time itself. And in that eternal darkness, if lead could speak and stone could whisper, what stories might they tell of the nights when the abbey echoes with more than just the wind, when the smell of centuries mingles with something else, something that reminds us that beneath all the marble and pageantry and royal dignity, we are all, in the end, just flesh and bone, waiting our turn to feed the darkness that claims us all.